It is the winter of 1943, and somewhere in the frozen forests of occupied Europe, a German sniper settles into position. He has done this 100 times before. He adjusts the elevation on his scope, steadies his breathing, and peers through the glass. What he sees is a British soldier moving through the tree line. Unhurried, almost careless. The sniper exhales. He squeezes the trigger. And then his scope explodes in his face. Not from a bullet, not from a bomb. From a two-penny strip of reflective material that the British had slipped into the battlefield weeks before he ever arrived. In the chaos that follows, the burning in his eye, the blood on his cheek, the ringing in his ears. The British soldier disappears back into the trees. The sniper never saw him again. And for the rest of that winter, a rumor spread through the German lines that the British had somehow found a way to make rifle scopes detonate. Some men refused to use them altogether. Others whispered that the British had developed a weapon that could sense when it was being watched and strike back. They were wrong, but they were not entirely wrong either. What the British had done was, in many ways, far cleverer than any weapon. They had weaponized light itself. They had taken the most basic properties of reflected optics and turned them into an instrument of psychological devastation, so effective that German snipers from the Eastern Front to Normandy would go to their graves convinced they had faced something supernatural. The device responsible for all of this cost almost nothing to produce. It required no gunpowder, no explosives, no moving parts. It was, in essence, a mirror. But understanding why a mirror could make trained soldiers believe in ghosts requires understanding the desperate problem that the British Army faced in the early years of the war. A problem so severe that it threatened to make every Allied infantryman in open terrain a target with no defense whatsoever. By 1941, German snipers had achieved something close to dominance on certain stretches of the front. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with a sniper program that was, by any reasonable measure, far ahead of anything the British had developed. German marksmen were equipped with the Kar 98 Kia fitted with the ZF-41 or the more powerful ZF-41 telescopic sights, precision instruments ground from high-quality optical glass, capable of resolving targets at ranges that made return fire essentially impossible. A skilled German sniper could engage a target at 800 meters with a first-round hit probability that horrified Allied planners when the casualty figures were compiled and analyzed. The mathematics were brutal. A sniper with a quality scope and a concealed position could, in a single morning, render an entire section of trench or woodland effectively impassable. Movement stopped. Resupply became impossible. The psychological effect on troops in the affected area was disproportionate even to the actual casualty rate. Men who had survived artillery barrages and aerial bombardment would find themselves paralyzed by the knowledge that a single unseen eye could end them the moment they raised their head above cover. Medical officers recorded a sharp rise in what they called sniper shock, a form of acute anxiety distinct from shell shock precisely because it was rational. The fear was entirely justified. The British response was initially inadequate. Counter-sniping, using your own snipers to locate and eliminate enemy snipers, worked when it worked, but required a quality of patience and skill that took months or years to develop in a trained soldier. Smoke screens were expensive, tactically limiting, and in many conditions simply unavailable. Armored shields were heavy, immobile, and created their own obvious signature that drew fire rather than deflecting it. What the British needed was something that could actively degrade the enemy sniper's ability to operate, not by killing him, but by making his primary tool, the telescopic sight, into a liability rather than an advantage. The insight that eventually produced the solution came not from a weapons designer, but from an understanding of basic optics that any schoolboy with a magnifying glass might have reached, had he been asked the right question. The right question was this: what happens to a beam of light when it enters a telescopic scope from the objective lens end? The answer, worked out by researchers at the Camouflage Development and Training Centre at Farnham in Surrey, and refined in collaboration with scientists at the then classified research establishment at Porton Down, was both simple and devastating. A telescopic sight is, in optical terms, a concentrating device. Its objective lens, the large forward-facing glass element that gathers incoming light, is designed to collect photons from a wide area and focus them into a narrow, magnified image for the eye at the eyepiece. This is precisely what makes it useful for seeing distant targets, but it means that any bright light source in the field of view is similarly concentrated. The scope takes diffuse ambient light and compresses it. If that light source is intense enough, a reflection, a flash, a concentrated point of brightness, the concentrated beam delivered to the sniper's eye is not merely uncomfortable. It is, at the right intensity, temporarily blinding. And if the source is a precisely angled mirror or reflective surface, the concentrated light hits the retina with enough force to cause a flash blindness that lasts anywhere from several seconds to several minutes. The device the British developed to exploit this was called, in various official documents, the sniper's mirror, or more formally, the anti-sniper reflective device, though it was rarely referred to by any consistent name in field use. It was, in its simplest form, a strip of polished metal or reflective material. In early prototypes, ordinary mirror glass. In later standardized production versions, a thin pressed steel plate with a chrome or nickel finish, measuring roughly 15 centimeters by 5 centimeters, or approximately 6 inches by 2 inches, in the imperial dimensions more familiar to the soldiers who use them. Weight varied by version, but rarely exceeded 90 grams. The entire device could be folded flat, slipped into a breast pocket, and forgotten about until needed. The manufacturing process was deliberately decentralized. Production records that survive in the National Archives at Kew indicate that at least 3 separate facilities contributed to output. A Birmingham metalworks that produced the pressed steel blanks, a Sheffield firm responsible for the reflective finishing process, and a London assembly operation that added the mounting hardware and packaged the devices for field distribution. This decentralization was partly a wartime necessity. No single factory could be allowed to represent a critical single point of failure for production, and partly a reflection of how inexpensive the components were. The raw material cost per unit, at 1943 prices, was estimated by the Procurement Office at less than 2 shillings. In today's terms, this is roughly equivalent to 10 pence, or, as the title of this piece suggests, approximately 2 cents in American currency. Deploying the device required nothing more complex than positioning it at an angle calculated to reflect sunlight, or, in overcast conditions, any available ambient light, back along the axis of an enemy observation position. Soldiers were trained to identify likely sniper hides, estimate the angle of the sun, and position the reflector accordingly. In practice, this often meant wedging the device into a convenient crevice in a wall or tree, or attaching it to a simple wooden stake that could be driven into the ground. When the geometry was correct and conditions favorable, the result was a concentrated beam of reflected light directed precisely into the objective lens of any scope trained on that position. The sniper, peering through his sight, received the full concentrated force of that reflected light directly into his eye. The first documented operational reports came from units in North Africa in late 1942. A sergeant with the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade described in his after-action notes encountering what he called a patch of ground the Jerry snipers wouldn't touch. An area of open desert that had been seeded with reflectors by a forward reconnaissance team. A German prisoner taken in the same sector reported to his interrogators that several of his unit's best marksmen had suffered what the prisoner called Blendung durch Teufelsglanz, blinding by devil's shine. He was not aware of any device. He genuinely believed the effect was caused by some form of British optical weapon that detected and responded to being observed. This was, as it happened, the British intention, not merely to blind snipers, but to create confusion about the nature of the threat. Captured German intelligence assessments from 1943 and 1944 show a progressive escalation of bewilderment about the phenomenon. Early reports attributed the blindings to an experimental British laser or focused light projector, a technology that did not yet exist in any deployable form. Later assessments, as more soldiers reported the effect occurring in conditions where no projector could plausibly be concealed, shifted to the hypothesis that the British had developed some form of reactive optical mine, a device that could sense an incoming beam of light through a scope and reflect it back with amplified intensity. This was technically incorrect, but conceptually closer to the truth than the laser hypothesis. The psychological result was the same regardless. German snipers began avoiding positions that had clear lines of sight to British-held ground. Several unit commanders issued orders restricting scope use during daylight hours in sectors where the blindings had been reported. In at least one documented case in the archives at the Imperial War Museum, a German company-level commander pulled his snipers from a tactically significant ridge because his men refused to use their scopes there, believing the ridge to be haunted by the British light weapon. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is the simplest way to ensure more of this kind of research reaches the people who want it. The German army was not, it must be said, without its own attempts to address the problem of optical vulnerability. The Wehrmacht's Optical Research Division at Jena, the same city that produced Carl Zeiss optics and whose lens-grinding traditions predated the war by a century, developed several prototype anti-reflection coatings for scope lenses in the middle years of the war. These coatings were intended to reduce the transmission of intense reflected light into the eyepiece, functioning on a principle not entirely unlike modern anti-glare treatments on spectacle lenses. The coatings worked to a degree. They reduced the intensity of the reflected beam by an estimated 30 to 40%, according to German test records recovered after the war. But 30 to 40% was not enough. A beam of concentrated sunlight reduced by a third is still capable of causing flash blindness at close-range angles. The coatings also introduced a minor but measurable degradation in image clarity, which made already difficult long-range target acquisition marginally harder. German snipers, given the choice between a scope that might blind them and a scope that was slightly less sharp, were not enthusiastic about the coating. Many requested uncoated lenses and accepted the risk. The American approach, by comparison, was characteristically direct. United States Army Ordnance had developed a dedicated sniper blinding program running broadly parallel to the British effort, using larger reflective panels mounted on adjustable tripods that could be precisely aimed using a rudimentary sighting mechanism attached to the frame. American panels measured roughly 30 centimeters square, twice the surface area of the British device, and were issued at platoon rather than section level. They were, by all accounts, effective. They were also considerably heavier, required a two-man team to deploy correctly in the field, and took several minutes to set up. The British reflector, by contrast, could be positioned by a single soldier in under 30 seconds. In the fast-moving conditions of the Normandy campaign and the subsequent advance through France and the Low Countries, this difference in deployment speed was not trivial. Several after-action reports from British infantry units in late 1944 specifically credit the speed of reflector deployment with preventing casualties during rapid advances through open ground, where stopping to set up a two-man American panel system would have been tactically impossible. The true historical legacy of the anti-sniper reflective device is difficult to calculate with precision, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. Casualty records from this period do not, in general, distinguish between sniper kill prevented by optical device and sniper kill prevented by other means. The psychological impact, the degradation of enemy sniper effectiveness, caused not by blindings that actually occurred, but by the fear of blindings that might occur, is entirely unquantifiable. What the surviving documentation does allow is a reasonable assessment of geographic spread. By the summer of 1944, reflective anti-sniper devices of British manufacture had been deployed in North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, and in limited numbers through the jungle campaigns in Burma, where different light conditions required modified deployment angles and frequently reduced effectiveness. The influence of the program on subsequent military optical research is clearer. After the war, the concept of optical vulnerability, the idea that a scope or any concentrating optical device could be turned against its user through deliberate reflection or light projection, became a permanent element of military camouflage doctrine. By the 1960s, multiple NATO armies had incorporated anti-glare considerations into scope design as a matter of standard specification, and training programs for snipers routinely included instruction on recognizing reflective surfaces in the environment. The laser rangefinders and targeting systems that became ubiquitous in modern military equipment from the 1970s onwards were designed from the outset with anti-reflection coatings and baffled objective lenses, partly in direct response to lessons learned from the wartime reflector program. Lessons that, in the official record, are attributed with careful academic neutrality to operational experience with optical countermeasures, but which trace directly back to a strip of polished steel produced in Birmingham for less than 2 shillings. Surviving examples of the device are rare. The majority were consumed in operational use, lost in the field, destroyed by weather, or simply discarded during the inevitable brutal pragmatism of a retreating army that cannot carry everything. Several examples are held in the collection of the Royal Armouries at Leeds, and at least 2 are on display at the Imperial War Museum in London, where they sit in a case alongside rather more dramatic-looking items and receive, in the observation of more than one museum visitor, considerably less attention than they deserve. Consider, for a moment, what was actually achieved. German soldiers trained to the highest standard in the most demanding marksmanship tradition in the world. Men who had honed a skill requiring years of patient discipline, who carried instruments of precision engineering that represented the finest optical technology their nation could produce, were stopped, confused, wounded, and in many cases rendered entirely ineffective by a device that cost the equivalent of a bus ticket to manufacture and could be carried in a shirt pocket. The technology was not sophisticated, the physics were not complex, the insight required was not, in retrospect, particularly difficult to reach. What was remarkable was that someone reached it, and reached it first, and understood not just the physical mechanism, but the psychological one. Understood that the true target was not the sniper's eye, but his confidence, not his body, but his belief in the tool he depended on absolutely. A sniper without faith in his scope is not a sniper. He is a man with a heavy rifle and a very long walk back to his lines. The British, with a strip of polished metal and an understanding of reflected light that would not have surprised Sir Isaac Newton, ensured that thousands of such men made that walk, and for the better part of 2 years, those men went to sleep at night, genuinely unsure whether the British had developed a weapon that could see them looking. It could. It just did not look anything like what they imagined.